Hey guys, tonight we drift through the velvet alleyways of 1990s Paris, where silence walks in suits and shadows wear cologne. Somewhere behind the golden haze of a midnight cafe lamp and the slick glint of wet cobblestone, there's a name whispered without a voice: Francis Vanverberghe. You won't find him in school books or tourist brochures, but his presence, it lingers in every hush between police sirens, in the deep bass lines of Pigaul's basement clubs, in the espresso foam of old cafes where the wrong people sip slowly. He never shouted. He never had to. You don't need a gun when your silence is already loaded. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Marseille, 1951. The harbor reeks of diesel, fish scales, and promises that will never be kept. A 6-year-old boy with a Corsican surname watches his uncle count money under a hanging lamp that swings like it's nervous. He doesn't blink when a coin rolls under the table. He's too focused on the knife beside the ashtray. Francis Vanverberghe learns early that Marseille isn't a city. It's a test. A place where boys don't get to ask why. His father, a dock worker with wrists like bridge cables, dies before Francis turns 8. Not in a dramatic shootout or heroic stand. He simply falls between 2 barges, and the sea swallows him like an unpaid debt. No ceremony, no closure, just a ripple, and the silence that always follows. The family moves into a tenement that smells like salt and mold. His mother stops speaking to neighbors. His older brother stops coming home. But Francis? He starts listening, really listening. He picks up the names whispered at the market, the nicknames exchanged behind cupped hands. Everyone's got secrets in Marseille. Some weigh more than bricks. By 12, he's running errands for a man named Jojo le Muet, Jojo the Mute, who speaks only with gestures and drives a Cadillac older than the Republic. Jojo sells cheap watches that stop working after 3 days, and information that never stops working at all. One day, Jojo hands Francis a sealed envelope and tells him to deliver it to the back door of a butcher shop on Rue Saint-Michel. No questions, no comments. Just take this and don't be seen. It's raining. Not the cinematic kind, just the soaking, bone-tiring drizzle that makes everything heavier. Francis walks with the envelope tucked inside his undershirt, pressed flat against his chest like a second rib. At the butcher's, he knocks twice, waits 6 seconds, then once more, just as Jojo told him. The door opens a crack. A large hand takes the envelope. The door shuts. He never hears about that job again, but 2 days later, he's given new shoes. Leather, not rubber, not cheap. No note, no receipt, just a quiet message. You did good. You're seen. That's how Marseille talks. Through gestures, gifts, silence is thick with meaning. As France reconstructs itself post-war, politicians debate coalitions while men like Jojo rebuild the streets their own way. With loyalty, with codes, with favors. And Francis, still a boy, is learning more from observing those men than he ever could in any school. He watches how they lean when they lie, how they breathe when they're telling the truth, how the good ones keep their hands still even when the world around them is trembling. He doesn't smile much, but when he does, it's slow, precise, like a curtain being drawn. And one evening, Jojo pats his shoulder and says, "You're too quiet for your age. That's good. Quiet lasts." The phrase sticks. Quiet lasts. Mainstream history might remember this era for the Marshall Plan, or for de Gaulle's rise, but in the creases of Marseille's underworld, a different kind of rebuilding is taking place. A quieter empire, born not in speeches, but in errands run without a word. Many people still think that Francis's early work with Jojo shaped his later style, the preference for subtle moves, the avoidance of direct confrontation, the way he'd rather win in whispers than in bullets. So what do you think? Was that envelope his first deal with the shadows, or just a test of silence? Because from that point on, the city stopped looking like home. It started looking like a chessboard. Corsica sits like a clenched fist in the Mediterranean, rocky, proud, and rarely forgiving. Even the trees seem to grow sideways, shaped by stubborn wind. That's where the Vanverberghe blood comes from. Though Francis was born in Marseille, his family's heart thudded to a Corsican rhythm. Loyalty over law, family over state, silence above all. His mother never let him forget. On Sundays, she lit candles and whispered to the Virgin Mary in a mix of French and Corsu, the local tongue that rolled like gravel in the mouth. When Francis asked why they didn't talk to the neighbors anymore, she said, "Because we're not them. Corsican roots are not decorative. They're armor. You don't share them, you carry them." During a brief visit to Bastia in his teenage years, Francis saw what those roots looked like up close. Relatives who never looked him in the eye. Boys his age who didn't smile. A grandfather with hands so weathered they seemed carved from bark. The island didn't welcome. It measured. And it measured Francis carefully. He passed, not because he impressed them, but because he didn't try to. That was his trick. That would always be his trick. Back in Marseille, his accent flattened, but the Corsican edge never dulled. It stayed in his walk, deliberate but light. It hid in the way he answered questions, not evasively, but just shy of full. Corsicans, he learned, don't ask twice. They don't forgive betrayal. They remember everything, even the tone of your voice when you last said goodbye. One afternoon, he overheard his uncle explaining the omerta, the code of silence. If someone hurts you, you settle it with the family. If the police ask questions, you forget your name. And if you ever speak out loud about what should stay buried, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The room just grew heavier. This wasn't some romanticized code from the movies. It wasn't about honor. It was about survival. Corsica, like Marseille, demanded resilience, but with a poetic ruthlessness. You weren't allowed to be loud, but you were required to be strong. Francis admired that. The idea that a man could hold an entire conversation with just a stare, that love could be proven in silence, that rage could be dressed in calm. By 17, he stopped raising his voice entirely. Even when cornered, even when threatened, a local boss once shoved him against a wall during a dispute over a shipment of stolen tires. Francis didn't flinch, didn't blink, just said quietly, "You're going to regret doing that in front of witnesses." And the man did. 2 days later, the same boss was hospitalized for a fall down a staircase with no railing. No one connected it to Francis. Not officially, not publicly. But after that, people started calling him Le Muet Nouveau, the new mute. A nod to Jojo, perhaps. But this time, the silence came with teeth. Mainstream historians might overlook this part of Francis's life, filing it under youthful brushes with crime or urban folklore. But those in the know, they point to this period, his teens in the alleyway between Marseille and Corsica, as the time Francis built his compass. Many people still think that his Corsican roots made him unbreakable, that the way he handled betrayal, quickly, silently, came from lessons whispered over fish stew and cheap brandy, on balconies no police ever reached. So what do you think? Was it the island that raised him, or the fact that it expected him not to need raising at all? Either way, Francis came back from Bastia a little colder, a little calmer, and with a new habit. He never sat with his back to a door again. Marseille has always been a teacher, just not the kind that hands out diplomas. By the time Francis turns 19, his school is the street corner, his textbook a deck of marked cards, and his professors come with broken noses and gold rings. He doesn't speak much, but he watches everything. And in Marseille, that's how you pass. The cafés on Rue Paradis hum with men who speak in ellipses. Everyone knows someone. Everyone owes someone. Francis, never eager to brag, becomes the kind of young man others trust. Not because he inspires comfort, but because he never repeats a word. That's worth gold in a city where secrets rot faster than fish. He starts small, running errands, carrying locked briefcases from one arrondissement to another. A man gives him an envelope. He returns with no change and no receipts. He learns the rhythm. Never show urgency. Always be 15 minutes early. Dress clean, but not rich. Never take the same route twice. Francis doesn't mind the quiet grind. He thrives in it. What separates him from the other young men in the game isn't aggression. It's posture. While others posture like they're in a film, Francis moves like someone who already knows how it ends. And it's never dramatic. It's just done. There's a story still told in whispers. A rival named Ludo once tried to muscle in on Francis's small operation near the port. Not with violence, just petty intimidation. Tearing down his flyers, threatening the vendors, whispering lies. Francis said nothing. 2 weeks later, Ludo's cousin was arrested for possession. The arresting officer? A man who just accepted 2 front-row seats to a football match, arranged quietly, anonymously. And Ludo? He vanished from the docks, not in a body bag, just reassigned, frightened, forgotten. That's the Francis touch. He doesn't remove people, he edits them out of the picture. By his early 20s, he's no longer just a courier. He's a fixer, the kind of man someone calls when they need a problem to disappear. Not violently, just permanently. One cafe owner tells the story like this. I had a tenant upstairs who wouldn't pay rent. I asked Francis what I should do. He said, tell him he'll be sharing the building with less quiet neighbors soon. The man moved out that week. No broken bones, no blood, just implication wrapped in calm. Francis's rules begin to solidify. Never overpromise. Never threaten aloud. If you have to be seen, make sure you're dressed better than anyone else in the room. He adopts the look, always in neutrals, sharp lapels, Italian shoes with no scuff marks. Not flashy, just exact. He still spends Sundays with his mother. They don't talk much. She serves soup. He eats it. That's their rhythm. One Sunday, she sets down his bowl and mutters, "You look like your father when you wear that jacket." Francis doesn't reply. He just adjusts the cuff, slow and silent. The compliment, if it was one, hangs in the air like steam. This is around the time when the older men start taking notice. Jojo. The mute is long gone, either in prison or Corsica, depending who you ask. But Francis now moves in circles where conversations happen in codes and laughs are more performance than pleasure. He plays his part with precision, doesn't drink, doesn't gamble, and yet he always seems to know who's winning. Mainstream history might record this period in Marseille with broad strokes. Immigration waves, political unrest, the slow rise of heroin routes through the port. But on the street level, it's the golden age of quiet power, and Francis is carving his initials into the concrete without leaving a mark. Many people still think this is when Francis realized his gift wasn't violence, it was precision. The ability to measure outcomes 3 steps ahead, to avoid mess by planning for the worst, but expecting less. So what do you think? Does power come from presence, or from how well you edit your absence? Because in Marseille, everyone knew his name by 23. But no one could tell you where he lived. A petty debt starts it all, not even his. It's 1974, and Francis is 29. Still young, but already composed like a man who has stopped needing to prove himself. He's sitting at a café near Gare Saint-Charles when a boy stumbles in, bleeding from the nose and lip. The boy's name is Karim. Just a runner. A mule with no muscle. Francis doesn't flinch, just sips his espresso and watches from behind his sunglasses. A man follows the boy in. Tall, loud, smelling of aftershave and cheap leather. He grabs Karim by the collar and says something about 30 francs missing from a package. Accuses him of skimming, of disrespect. Francis doesn't know the boy well. He's delivered a few things here and there. Always polite, always punctual. But more importantly, he never lies. That's what Francis had noticed. Karim is the rare kind of runner who says, "I don't know." When he doesn't know, the man slaps him, right there in front of everyone. And Francis quietly sets down his cup. He stands, smooths his jacket, and walks over. No theatrics, no threats. He leans in close and whispers something in the man's ear. No one hears what he says, but the man goes pale, steps back, and leaves without another word. Karim wipes his lip. Francis hands him a napkin and goes back to his espresso. That night, Francis receives a package at his apartment. No return address. Inside, a sealed envelope with 10,000 francs in cash, and a note written in block capitals. Debt paid, loyalty recognized. It's the moment everything shifts. He didn't just protect a runner. He made a statement. Respect is not optional, even for the lowest in the chain. Word spreads fast, faster than bullets. In the weeks that follow, 3 low-tier crews approach Francis. Not for revenge, quite the opposite. They want in. Quiet protection, guidance, maybe just the illusion of being near his name. He doesn't say yes, but he doesn't say no either. Instead, he starts hosting small gatherings, private meals in back rooms of restaurants, where cell phones are checked at the door, and the only rule is, speak only if you're asked to. He listens more than he talks, observes, learns. And he starts noticing the gaps in the Paris underworld, where control is slipping, where greed is louder than caution, where loyalty has become a word, not a law. He smells opportunity, and not just in Marseille. He begins making quiet visits to Paris, stays at a modest hotel in the 17th arrondissement, eats alone, no entourage, no fuss, but always leaves with a new contact, a new piece of the puzzle. Paris in the mid-1970s is shifting. Old school bosses are dying off. The new ones are flashy, impatient. They throw loud parties. They trust too quickly. Francis watches it all with mild amusement. He doesn't belong to that world yet, but he already knows it will belong to him. One night, he sits across from an aging Corsican fixer named Pascalo in a jazz bar off Rue Oberkampf. Pascalo leans in and says, "Paris is loud now, too loud. Men like you, we need that silence back." Francis doesn't reply, just taps the side of his glass twice. 2 weeks later, Pascalo retires, moves to Corsica, leaves a list behind. Contacts, codes, access, a quiet endorsement. Mainstream history won't remember the shift. Too subtle, too polite. But within the circles that mattered, Francis had stepped onto the Parisian board, and he didn't need to declare it. His actions did the talking. Many people still think that moment at the cafe, the debt, the slap, the whisper, was the real beginning of his rise. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. So, what do you think? Is power inherited, or does it find the one least likely to flaunt it? Because from that day forward, Francis didn't just walk through Marseille. He walked above it, and Paris had no idea he was coming. The train from Marseille to Paris hums like a thought held too long. It slices through countryside, tunnels, suburbs, pulling Francis steadily toward a city that doesn't know it's being studied. He rides alone. No bags, no company. Just a folded newspaper he never reads and a suitcase he never opens. He likes it that way. It's 1976, and Paris is shifting again. The old Gaullist guard still looms, but the underbelly has started mutating. New drugs, new faces, old debts returning in shinier cars. Francis steps onto the platform at Gare de Lyon like he stepped into a chessboard. Everything calculated. He doesn't dive into the scene. He doesn't arrive with gunmen or flash. Instead, he rents a modest apartment in the 17th arrondissement. Quiet, residential, the kind of place where you can hear your neighbor's coffee boil if you're listening close. He isn't hiding. He's blending. He takes long walks, eats alone, observes. He visits restaurants near Pigalle, listens to the cadence of dealers, the brash confidence of new pimps who don't know what silence can cost. He notices which bars keep 2 sets of books, which bouncers wear boots meant for kicking more than just drunks. One night, he sits in a nearly empty brasserie across from a man named Roland, a mid-tier smuggler with ambitions too large for his manners. "I don't get it," Roland says, swirling his wine. "You've been here a month. You haven't made any moves. What are you waiting for?" Francis doesn't answer right away. He takes a slow sip. Then, for the right person to say too much, Roland laughs. But a week later, he's arrested, talked too loudly about a cocaine shipment at a party filled with off-duty officers. Francis never comments, but he does start getting calls. A well-known Parisian club owner invites him for a private drink. A Corsican loan shark asks for his opinion on a debt that's grown too personal. A former police contact from Marseille offers to introduce him to a man with keys to some very interesting doors. Francis accepts none of these invitations outright, but he listens, and he starts to be seen, not loudly, but noticeably. Like a painting you never saw until someone pointed it out. The Paris underworld doesn't know what to make of him. He's not flashy like the Albanians, not brutish like the Eastern Bloc crews. He's not trying to impress anyone, but when he walks into a room, conversations slow by a beat. He starts small again, just like Marseille. A favor here, a debt collected without force, a whispered tip about a customs officer who drinks too much and talks even more. One night, he orchestrates the quiet transfer of 6 stolen vehicles, worth over 1 million francs, through a port warehouse no one's thought to check in years. He doesn't even touch the cars, but he ensures the keys are in the right hands, the documents doctored, the route clear. Everyone gets paid. No one gets hurt. And suddenly, Paris has a new name in its Rolodex of necessary shadows. A local inspector years later would recall, "He didn't move like a criminal. He moved like a manager, the kind who could run a company or a coup." Mainstream historical records might credit the 1970s with the rise of narcotics in Paris, the shifting political tides, the decay of certain moral structures. But beneath all that, men like Francis were planting seeds, and those seeds didn't grow loudly, they grew deep. Many people still think this slow, deliberate entry into Paris was his real genius, that he didn't need to fight for territory, because he waited until others gave it away. So what do you think? Is conquest louder when it happens fast, or more complete when it's quiet enough to sleep through. Because by the end of that year, Francis isn't just in Paris, he's under it, in its cracks, its silences, and the city doesn't even know it's already his. Paris doesn't test you with bullets. It tests you with patience. Francis learns this quickly. It's not the man who fires first who wins here. It's the one who knows when not to draw at all. In 1977, the test comes dressed in cologne and cocaine, wearing a gold watch 2 inches too big. His name is Leo Leclerc Marchand, a nickname meaning the key, though no one can remember what door he ever opened. Leo runs a nightclub in Belleville, loud, flashy, full of cheap celebrities and even cheaper security. He thinks he owns the block because he pays the cops once a month and throws free drinks at washed-up singers. Francis watches Leo swagger through rooms like a man renting power by the hour. Their first encounter is accidental, at least to Leo. He bumps into Francis outside a small brasserie, spills wine on his coat, and mutters something dismissive about old men in suits. Francis just looks at him, calm, measured, careful, he says. Some coats stain deeper than others. That should have been the end of it. But men like Leo mistake silence for softness. 2 nights later, one of Francis's runners is refused entry at Leo's club. Roughly, loudly. That same week, the music system at Leo's club shorts out twice. The next, 2 deliveries of imported rum go missing. Then a tax inspector shows up, asking questions about receipts Leo thought had been handled. Leo complains to everyone, whines to anyone, but no one helps. He tries to retaliate, sends a man to trail Francis. The man returns shaken, says he lost him at a bakery and hasn't slept well since. Then comes the night of reckoning. Francis walks into Club Mirage wearing a navy wool coat tailored to exact silence. He doesn't ask permission. He doesn't bring backup. He sits at the bar and orders an espresso. No one moves. Leo approaches, blustering. "You got something to say?" Francis stirs his espresso. Doesn't look up. Then he says, "If you close this place for 3 days, fix your books, and learn how to behave, you'll get to keep your teeth. Not all your business. Just your teeth." Leo laughs, loudly, then sees the 2 men near the door, not moving, not smiling, just watching. Leo's laughter stops. The club closes the next day for renovation. It reopens the following week with new staff, a smaller clientele, and a respectful silence whenever Francis's name is mentioned. That single moment earns Francis his unofficial welcome. The Paris crews start calling him Monsieur Non. Not because he says no often, but because once he does, things tend to stop existing. He's now seen not just as an operator, but as a man with his own gravitational pull. He moves on to handling disputes. Not violently, not loudly. He becomes the preferred arbitrator for men who don't trust courts. A jeweler is accused of swapping real diamonds for fakes. Francis invites both parties to a private room in a Montmartre bakery basement. They leave 2 hours later, one with cash, the other with a quietly broken finger. No shouting, no police, no paper trail. And above it all, Francis remains calm. Always a half-second slower to speak than expected. That's what makes people listen. Mainstream historical accounts will say the late 70s were politically unstable, economically inconsistent, and culturally explosive in Paris. But in the quiet layers beneath that chaos, Francis was building something more permanent than any policy. A reputation. Many people still think the Club Mirage incident was a turning point. Not because of the threat, but because of the restraint. So what do you think? Is fear more effective when whispered, or when it walks in alone and orders an espresso? Because by now, Paris doesn't just know Francis Vanverberghe. It makes sure to check who's watching before it says his name. By 1978, Paris knows him not as a legend, but as a presence. The way one knows the weight of rain clouds before the first drop lands. His name isn't shouted in bars or scribbled in notebooks. It drifts through offices and corner shops like steam. Vanverberghe. You don't need to know what he does. You only need to know he does it, and always he does it without a wrinkle. Francis becomes known for the suit. Always fitted, never flamboyant. Clean lapels, crisp cuffs, and ties knotted like signatures. His shoes, polished to a whisper. His scent, subtle. Something like old wood and ironed linen. One prosecutor once joked, "If you see Francis and his collar is creased, run. Something's already gone wrong." His presence begins to shift the tone of rooms. Restaurant owners pause their laughter. Waiters straighten their backs. Even men who don't work for him, not yet, lower their voices when discussing certain deals. He doesn't need an entourage. He has ambiance. Francis's style is not mere performance. It's weaponized precision. In a city where reputation and posture write contracts, he sharpens his appearance like a blade. He rents a small office near Parc Monceau. No sign on the door. Just a buzzer and an elevator that creaks like it's in on the secrets. Inside, the space is quiet. No clocks, no phones that ring. Just leather chairs and one desk. People come in nervous and leave changed. Sometimes with smiles, sometimes with handkerchiefs, always with clarity. He begins to partner discreetly with small real estate firms. Not for profit, yet, but for infrastructure. Brick by brick, he's laying a network that doesn't need passwords or computers. One deal stands out, an abandoned textile warehouse near Saint-Ouen. Worthless on paper, useless according to brokers. Francis buys it, quietly. Within a year, it's converted into storage for a logistics company no one's ever heard of. But suddenly, rare shipments glide through Paris with no delay. High-end watches, contraband cigarettes. Occasionally, items no one will describe. Just exchange. Francis never signs anything. His name is never on the deeds. But his coffee cup is always waiting on the second floor. He doesn't brag. Others do that for him. One night, a mid-level gangster from the 20th arrondissement tries to impress his crew by name-dropping Francis at a poker table. Claims they're old friends. 3 days later, his apartment burns. No casualties, no arrests. Just a blackened plaque on the door that once said, Room 12. Francis never acknowledges the fire. But he does attend a dinner with one of the city's top importers that same evening. Wearing a slightly darker suit than usual, the message is clear. Keep his name where it belongs. Unsaid, untouched. Mainstream accounts may glance at Francis in this period as a background figure in the evolving Parisian crime landscape. They mention smuggling rings, unsolved robberies, the rise of invisible brokers. But those who were there, they say this was the golden age of la tension élégante, the elegant tension, the sense that someone, somewhere, had already decided how your night would end, and you were simply catching up. Many people still think his decision to never flaunt wealth made him more dangerous than those who did, because men who need to show power often lack it. So what do you think? Is the sharpness in the suit or in the silence behind it? Because by now, Francis Vanverberghe doesn't just look the part, he is the part, and Paris adjusts its tie accordingly. There are heists that make headlines, and then there are the ones that disappear into wine cellars. In the fall of 1979, an unusual operation unfolds in the vineyards of Bordeaux. No alarms, no ski masks, just crates of what appears to be vintage wine moving through back roads and onto refrigerated trucks. Everything seems legal, except the wine isn't real, not entirely fake either, just not what the label promises. The bottles say 1955 Margaux, aged to perfection, but the contents? A cheap blend, touched up with food-grade tannin, and a splash of actual vintage to fool even trained palates. The label printers? Based in Belgium. The corks? Shipped from Spain. The paperwork? Signed in Luxembourg by a company that doesn't technically exist. It's elegant. So elegant, in fact, that French customs officials don't catch on for 6 months. And by the time they do, the crates are gone. The profits are clean. And Francis Vanverberghe is sitting at a small cafe, sipping tea, not wine, and reading a newspaper he's already memorized. They call it the wine whisper job in Whispers, though no one dares accuse Francis outright. But the timing lines up, the logistics match, and the people who handled the routing, well, let's just say they now work in real estate under Francis's umbrella. This heist isn't just profitable, it's a flex, a message. He didn't need guns, he didn't need muscle, just timing, leverage, and taste. It marks his shift from backroom broker to shadow magnate. Suddenly, doors open a little faster. Invitations arrive with fewer questions. One club owner sends him a bottle of real Margot. No note, just respect. Francis accepts, drinks 1 glass, and gifts the rest to the building concierge. He begins frequenting art galleries. Not to buy, but to be seen, not buying. His presence becomes a signature of power. The man who could, but doesn't. People start mimicking him. Young upstarts order espresso instead of whiskey. Mid-tier operators ditch gold chains for cufflinks. They don't realize he notices. He does. He files it all away in that quiet cabinet behind his eyes, the one no one's ever picked open. One night, a young broker named Etienne corners him at an event and tries to pitch a counterfeit perfume scheme. Big margins, low risk, he insists. Francis listens, nods once, then says, "Perfume evaporates, wine stains." That's the end of the meeting. And a week later, Etienne is seen working security at a shopping mall. The lesson spreads. Francis doesn't do cheap. Not in product. Not in people. He doesn't build empires with glue and hope. He uses precision, loyalty, and quiet disdain for shortcuts. Mainstream history might dismiss this fake wine period as a minor scandal or a forgotten customs footnote. But in Paris's darker corners, it becomes a myth. The job that proved Francis wasn't just playing in the underworld, he was refining it. Many people still think the brilliance wasn't in the money made, but in how much more everyone respected him afterward. So what do you think? Is it the wine that ages, or the legend bottled inside it? Because after this, no one in Paris dares offer Francis a cheap vintage again. And every time someone opens a bottle near him, they glance at the label twice. Just to be sure, Paris wakes up to the news. A jeweler is dead. Not just any jeweler. Jean-Paul Delanoy, a man whose shop catered to politicians, mistresses, and the occasional arms dealer with a romantic streak. Shot once in the neck, once in the heart. Clean. No sign of forced entry. No cameras. No noise. The police call it a targeted robbery, but nothing is missing. Not a ring, not a watch. The whispers say otherwise. They say Jean-Paul knew too much. About what? That's where the threads tangle. Some say he'd been fencing rare stones for an Algerian syndicate and got sloppy. Others claim he bragged at a dinner party about helping someone hide diamonds inside a senator's yacht. But the most persistent rumor? That he'd been holding a ledger, not a notebook. The notebook. A record of discreet exchanges, hush-hush deals, and payments wrapped in velvet envelopes. And that someone, somewhere, wanted it gone. The police investigate for a while, make a show of it, interview his widow, search the vaults, question a few known faces. But it all goes cold within weeks. Too many dead ends. Too much silence. And in that silence, Francis Vanverberghe's name floats up. Not in official reports, of course, just between those who pay attention. Why him? No one can say. There's no link on paper, no motive, no witness. But here's what people notice. A month before the murder, Jean-Paul hosted a private evening for a select group of clients. Only 6 people invited. One of them, a quiet man in a charcoal suit who didn't touch the canapés and left before the wine was uncorked. He signed in under Monsieur V. No one saw him speak to Jean-Paul. But afterward, the jeweler grew jittery, changed the locks, hired a private driver. A week before the murder, Francis is seen at a gallery opening, laughing, actually laughing with a woman in red. When asked what he finds so funny, he replies, "Some people forget silence is a currency until they can't afford it." The next day, Jean-Paul withdraws 10,000 francs in cash. The day after that, he's dead. Coincidence? Maybe. But those who know Francis know better than to believe in accidents. He doesn't deal in anger. He deals in outcomes. And when Jean-Paul's shop reopens 6 weeks later under new management, the clientele quietly shifts. Fewer suits, more leather, less champagne, more caution. One man, a mid-tier buyer, swears he saw one of Francis's associates behind the counter. Just once, counting earrings, gloved hands moving like a surgeon's. He never tells the police, just cashes out and moves to Nice. Francis never speaks about the murder, never acknowledges it. But shortly afterward, he's seen with a new watch, slim, understated, the kind Delanoy used to keep under the counter for clients who never asked for prices. Mainstream media forgets the murder within the year. Another case, unsolved. But many people still think the death was a quiet audit. Not for revenge, but for record-keeping, to ensure that nothing survives longer than loyalty. So what do you think? When secrets sparkle too brightly, is it better to bury the man or the memory? Because in Paris, a diamond can buy silence, but silence, once broken, buys you nothing but a date no one circles on the calendar. By the early 1980s, Francis doesn't just glide through Paris. He weaves into it, like thread in a tapestry. His name is less spoken than suggested, like a pause in a sentence where the subject has already been understood. And the people who used to run the game, they're starting to step aside or be quietly stepped over. Not by violence, by favors. Francis is now a friend of men who don't have friends. Judges with silent vices, inspectors with fading pensions, politicians whose brothers-in-law own warehouses they'd rather not explain. He doesn't bribe. That's for amateurs. He remembers birthdays. He sends bottles of vintage whiskey to widowers who think no one's watching. He shows up when no one else does. And always, he listens more than he speaks. One of his oldest habits, one he picked up in Marseille, comes in handy now, keeping track of who owes what to whom, but never saying it aloud. Instead, he nudges. A delayed favor here, a reminder over lunch there. He never says, "You owe me." He simply tilts his head and waits for the silence to speak, and in that silence things get done. One inspector, long retired, once said, "If Francis ever offered you help, it was like being handed a life preserver made of stone. It would float for a time, but eventually you'd have to carry the weight." That was the magic of Francis. He never forced loyalty. He made it feel like your own idea. He becomes especially close with 2 key players. A former intelligence officer turned logistics consultant who knows exactly which cargo containers aren't checked at Charles de Gaulle Airport. A Gaullist deputy with gambling debts who suddenly finds his slate clean, and a construction firm under his nephew's name getting large public contracts. Francis doesn't exploit them. He folds them into the network, gives them value, purpose, deniability. They don't feel trapped. They feel useful. That's how he wins. Not with fear, with elegance. The newspapers run stories about rising crime, missing arms shipments, and a growing concern about foreign influence in Parisian black markets. They mention names, point fingers, but Francis's never appears. He's not loud enough to chase, not dirty enough to stick. Yet insiders start calling his reach le fil noir, the black thread, because once it's around something, it doesn't let go, and it's impossible to see where it begins. A quiet example. A customs official gets promoted. That same week, a forgotten shipment of Turkish pistols gets reclassified as agricultural equipment and rolls quietly into a facility near Orly. No receipts, no fingerprints, just a note tucked into a crate. Merci pour votre patience. Mainstream historians like to credit political decay for the underworld's growth in this period. Corruption, bureaucracy, weak oversight. And sure, all those things helped, but many people still think Francis didn't just fill the gaps in the system. He became the system. So what do you think? Is power more dangerous when it wears a mask or when it wears a smile tailored to fit? Because by 1983, if you want something moved through Paris quietly, you don't need to know a dozen men. You just need to know one, and you'd better hope he already knows you. By 1984, the city that once sized Francis up now makes space for him automatically. Side doors unlock. Elevator buttons stay lit until he steps in. Restaurant tables that were fully booked suddenly appear beside windows. He never asks. He simply arrives. The money is flowing now, but never ostentatiously. It seeps into concrete, not champagne. Francis begins investing through shell companies, each one buried beneath 5 layers of fiction. His primary interest? Real estate, not luxury towers, apartments, low-rise blocks, parking structures, the kind of properties no one pays attention to, except those who need them. He buys a derelict row of buildings on Rue Saint-Blaise. Within 6 months, they're renovated into residential units with secured basements, private elevators, and front doors that require a phone call to open. The city assumes he's housing working-class tenants. And he is, just not the kind who file complaints. The cash gets laundered through renovation budgets, tile receipts, electrical contracts. Entire wings of his network are now maintenance firms, storage companies, security consultants. And if anyone asks too many questions, they end up reviewing permits in the 12th arrondissement for the next decade. But Francis doesn't just build safe houses, he builds trust. One client, a South American courier with a nervous stutter, says, "I stayed in one of his buildings for 6 weeks, didn't hear a sound. Every night, same knock, 3 times, a plate of food. No words, just food." He starts drawing in foreign clients now, quiet figures from Antwerp, Naples, Tangier, men with accents and polite smiles who shake hands like surgeons. They come for shelter, for passage, for storage, and what they get is structure. Francis doesn't promise them protection. He offers systems, routes that run on silence, schedules that hum without announcement. A city mapped not by streets, but by understanding. He also begins buying up warehouses in the 18th and 19th arrondissements, not for storage, but as trade zones, places where cargo could be swapped, cataloged, and, if needed, made to vanish. One journalist, years later, tries to piece it together. He describes it like this: Vanverberghe turned Paris into a switchboard. Nothing originated with him, but everything passed through. The police raid one of the facilities. Nothing's there. No drugs. No weapons. Just pallets of linens and paperwork so clean they sparkle. And yet, the officer who leads the raid gets reassigned a month later. Rumors say someone found old photos of him with someone he shouldn't have known. No arrest, just a career pause. Francis doesn't react. He simply sends a bottle of 1980 Pauillac to the commissioner's office. No card, and still, no one can pin him. No fingerprints, no voice recordings. The few who've tried to flip on him, well, they've all developed sudden urges to move abroad. Mainstream narratives chalk this era up to organized smuggling rings and loopholes in border enforcement. But the people in the know? They say this was Francis's true golden period. Many people still think that by hiding behind drywall and insulation contracts, Francis ran a more efficient system than customs ever could. So what do you think? Can an empire be built on blueprints and silence? Because by the time the decade closes, Paris doesn't just house his network. It is his network, bricked, wired, and whispering behind every wall. Every empire needs a stage. For Francis, that stage comes alive in the dim pulse of Club Les, a sleek, subterranean nightclub nestled just off Boulevard de Clichy. No flashing sign, no velvet rope, just a brass doorbell and a door that opens only if you've already been heard about. He doesn't own it on paper, of course. The license sits under the name of a retired dancer with 6 cats and no passport. But everyone knows whose smile the bartenders wait for. Les isn't the kind of place that needs a crowd. In fact, it prefers the opposite. No one ever dances there, unless the mood is right. Music plays low, mostly jazz or deep house that sways like a cigarette in slow wind. The drinks are excellent, the walls are soundproof, the booths are private. And the back room? That's where Paris turns sideways. It's not big, just 2 leather chairs, a wooden table with a single burn mark, and a coat rack that's never full. There's no camera, no register, only conversations that start with, "I heard you might be able to." Francis doesn't sit in that room often, maybe once a week, maybe less. But when he does, business hums. One night, an arms dealer from Prague flies in and waits 5 hours just to shake his hand. Another time, a former minister arrives through the kitchen entrance and leaves 15 minutes later with eyes heavier than his briefcase. No shouting, no drama, just signatures made with eye contact. Francis treats the club like an embassy, a place where different languages meet, and none of them say too much. Even the staff follows a strict rhythm. Never ask names, never comment on orders, and if a guest asks for the usual and you don't know what that is, just nod and pour water. Les becomes more than a meeting point. It becomes a signal. If someone's seen there twice in 1 week, people notice. If they're seen there with Francis, people adjust. Alliances shift. Rivals retreat. And Francis? He rarely speaks above a murmur. He takes meetings not with urgency, but with inevitability. His expression stays unchanged, as if every deal has already been done somewhere behind his eyes. One legend says a man once came to the club uninvited, drunk, arrogant, fresh from a casino win. He boasted loudly at the bar, claimed he ran this city now. The music didn't stop. The bartender didn't blink. But the next morning, the man's hotel room was found empty, not ransacked, just vacant, with nothing left but his cufflinks on the pillow. He left France within the week, bought a vineyard in Portugal, never returned. Francis never mentioned it. But the cufflinks? They matched the kind Francis once gave out, only to men who'd earned the exit. Mainstream media never connects these dots. The club doesn't appear in any exposés. No tabloids ever leak photos. But underground operators, dealers, fixers, even cops begin referring to any smooth handoff as a Les handshake. Many people still think the club wasn't just a base. It was his mirror. Elegant, controlled, selective. So what do you think? Can a few shadows, a locked door, and good jazz hold a city's secrets together, because by now, Francis Vanverberghe doesn't need to make noise to move the room. He just needs to walk in, adjust his cuffs, and sit down. And the rest follows. The shipment was supposed to vanish. A simple handoff in Montenegro. But when you deal in weapons, even silence can get noisy. It starts with a whisper. Someone in Belgrade asking questions about a crate that went missing en route to Marseille. Not unusual. Paperwork slips. Borders blur. But this time, the crate isn't just full of weapons. It's full of Kalashnikovs, fresh, unmarked, and meant for people who don't issue receipts. And yet, days later, one of those very rifles turns up in a gang dispute in Lyon. A gun with no history, just blood. Authorities scramble. How did an Eastern Bloc weapon find its way into a French basement without tripping a single alarm? The answer, of course, isn't in the gun. It's in the path the gun never officially took. Some say the shipment passed through Antwerp, disguised as machine parts. Others swear it was trucked across the Alps, nested between crates of legal textiles. But those who really know Paris, really know, point quietly to Francis, because only someone like him could choreograph that kind of invisible ballet. He doesn't touch the merchandise, never has, but his fingerprints are philosophical, found in timing, discretion, and the absence of noise. It's the Vanverberghe equation. If something dangerous needs to cross a border, it must do so politely, like it's been invited. And weapons, after all, are just rude questions. Francis always preferred quiet answers. A meeting is held, low lit, in the back of a church that hasn't held mass since the 60s. Present are 3 men, a Yugoslav fixer with one good eye, a French logistics coordinator who smells of printer ink, and Francis, impeccably dressed, as if he wandered in from an art gallery. He says only this: "No second chances. From now on the boxes must breathe clean." The men nod. One swallows hard. The problem is solved. The Kalashnikov shipment disappears from headlines just as fast as it entered. Weeks later, a customs officer is promoted. A Marseille inspector is reassigned. A warehouse burns down. Quietly. No injuries. Francis keeps moving. Not with panic, but with elegance. He understands that in moments of tension, one must tighten the silence, not loosen it. He has lieutenants now, not soldiers, technicians, men and women who handle documents like they're operating theater scalpels. They use language like acid, enough to remove names from paper without burning the edges. His preferred courier is a woman in her 60s with a limp and a librarian smile. She once transported a diamond the size of a child's tooth tucked inside a Bible. He surrounds himself with quiet brilliance, never aggression. A story circulates. A rival crew tried to reroute a small arms shipment without his blessing. 2 weeks later, their warehouse was sealed due to asbestos. The permit to reopen? Still pending. Francis doesn't gloat, but he does send the head of the rival crew a bottle of vintage scotch with a simple note. Dust is slow, but thorough. Mainstream media never links him to weapons. They chase louder names, flashier faces. But the underworld knows. Many people still think the Kalashnikov incident was his most delicate move, not because of the guns, but because of how quietly he turned a fire into fog. So what do you think? Is danger more terrifying when it's loud, or when it whispers through customs with perfect paperwork? Because in Paris, the loudest threats come with echo. But Francis? He arrives like mist and leaves only clarity. In Bastia, the sky rolls slow over the sea, like a curtain drawn by an old hand. Corsica doesn't ask you to return. It just waits. And in the spring of 1985, Francis returns. No fanfare, no entourage, just a chartered flight, a dark suit, and a ring box in his pocket. he's here to marry. Her name is Leia. No maiden surnames are discussed in public. What's known is that she's Corsican by blood, Parisian by demeanor, and uncommonly good at making even inspectors nervous. They've been together for 2 years, quietly. She was never a mistress, never a conquest, just there. Always seated slightly to his left, always leaving parties before the second drink. The wedding isn't in a cathedral or city hall. It's held in a whitewashed chapel on the edge of Cap Corse, where the pews creak and the candles burn with a humility that even time respects. No photos are published. No journalists catch wind. But in the underworld, word travels like wind across dry leaves. And everyone understands what this really is. It's not just a wedding. It's a Corsican oath renewed. Because in Francis's world, marriage is more than sentiment. It's signal. A line drawn in sand that says, I am still one of ours. Don't mistake elegance for betrayal. The guest list? A delicate calculus. 3 men from Marseille, 2 from Naples, 1 Parisian, escorted by a priest. The rest are family, not by blood, but by debt. During the reception, a retired smuggler gifts him a vintage pistol wrapped in velvet. Francis declines with a smile, saying, I prefer weapons that don't fit in drawers. The laughter that follows is genuine. The message, clearer still. Leia wears a dress without embroidery. No lace, just silk, soft enough to vanish into evening light. When asked why she chose it, she replies, because it doesn't make a sound when I walk. They exchange vows in Corsican, the ancient dialect spoken low like a spell. At the end, the officiant, an old monk with hands that tremble when idle, says simply, may your silence speak loudest. And Francis uncharacteristically nods. The couple doesn't stay for a honeymoon. Instead, they return to Paris within 48 hours. Back to the pulse, the concrete, the phone calls that end before they begin. But everything's different now, because to the island, he's reaffirmed allegiance. To the network, he's cemented the rules. Family isn't just who you protect, it's who protects your name when you're not there. Loyalty isn't a request. It's a currency with no exchange rate. Silence isn't weakness. It's the signature beneath the oath. He begins moving differently, not more cautiously, more deliberately. One Parisian boss tries to test him, sending a veiled message through a nightclub promoter. Something about new territories and shared opportunity. Francis replies with a wedding photo. No words, just him and Leia, standing before a Corsican chapel. The message lands, nothing more is said. Mainstream society doesn't register the marriage. There's no announcement in the paper. No mentions in glossy gossip columns. But in the rooms where silence is currency, this union is considered a treaty. Many people still think the Corsican wedding wasn't about love or family, but about power wrapped in ritual. So what do you think? Can vows spoken softly bind tighter than laws carved in stone? Because after this, no one asks where Francis's loyalty lies. It's written in chapel ash and wedding silence, and Paris takes a breath, knowing who he truly belongs to. The day Claude disappears, the newspapers are quiet. Not silent, just carefully worded. Investigative journalist missing after tip-off, one headline reads. Another says, no signs of foul play yet. But those who really pay attention don't need headlines to feel the tension. They know Claude Montreuil, mid-40s, sharp dresser, sharper questions. Known for poking where polite society pretends nothing is buried. A journalist with an instinct for corruption and a habit of staying 5 minutes too long at dangerous dinner tables. He'd been digging into property records in Paris's 17th arrondissement. Kept asking why so many buildings led back to the same construction firm no one could contact. The firm's name? S.A. Giroux. A paper entity with no phone number, no physical office, and a bank account that never dipped below 1,000,000 francs. And Claude? He'd started asking about the real owner. He told a colleague, "I think I'm brushing against something very old, very quiet." He never made it to his next meeting. His car was found parked neatly near Parc Monceau, keys in the ignition, coat folded in the back seat, no blood, no note, just the unmistakable hum of a door that had closed without force. The police open an investigation, then narrow it, then close it, citing lack of evidence. And all the while, Francis Vanverberghe doesn't blink. No one publicly connects him to Claude. But privately, those in the know, they lower their voices. Because the building Claude had been researching, it sits just 2 blocks from Club Lizette, and the last person to see Claude was a bartender who remembered him sipping a Negroni alone, notebook half filled, glancing now and then at the entrance. Francis never responds to questions. But a week after the disappearance, a newspaper receives an unmarked envelope. Inside, Claude's notebook, intact, pages torn only where names were written. No message, just enough to say, "This far and no further." People take the hint. The journalists stop poking. The articles dry up. The silence is reinstated, smooth as ever, and Paris moves on, or pretends to. Behind the scenes, Francis tightens his web. He promotes 2 lieutenants, one to oversee construction permits, another to handle communications. Neither asks questions. Both receive modest apartments and phone numbers that change monthly. The disappearance becomes a ghost story among younger reporters. A cautionary tale whispered in newsrooms when someone starts chasing shadows without gloves. Mainstream history, of course, forgets Claude. He becomes a footnote in press freedom debates, but in the quiet layers beneath the city's noise, the rules become clearer. You can write about corruption. You can hint at secrets. But you do not say Francis's name. Not in ink. Not in breath. Many people still think that Claude's disappearance wasn't punishment. It was preservation. A reminder that the city only stays intact because some stories choose not to be told. So what do you think? Is truth a candle that burns too hot? Or a door better left unopened? Because by now, Paris doesn't need to be told where the line is. It feels it, like a chill in the room, and it's wearing a suit. They call it the Vanverberghe method. Not publicly, of course. No government document bears the term. No training manual explains it. But in private conversations, between men who wear suits to lunch and never finish their drinks, it's mentioned with a nod, a slight lowering of the voice. It isn't a handbook. It's a discipline, a way of being. Francis never invented it outright. He just perfected it. Here's how it works. First, remove emotion. Rage is noise. Desperation leaves trails. In Francis's world, you never raise your voice. If you're breathing heavy, you've already lost. Second, delegate in layers. No one person ever knows more than they need. If a shipment is moved, the driver doesn't know the buyer. If a payment is made, the courier never sees the source. The Vanverberghe method treats knowledge like voltage, dangerous in large doses. Third, paper is poison. Nothing is written. If it must be remembered, it is memorized. If it must be discussed, it's done in motion, walking slowly through a park, always 1 foot in front of the other. And fourth, control is subtle. Never through force, through routine. Once you can predict a man's week, you can own his future. Francis trains his lieutenants personally, never in a group, always one-on-one, over coffee or after hours. Lessons are spoken once, then never repeated. If you forget, you don't ask again. One of his most trusted men, known only as Lucian, once described the training like this. He didn't teach us how to lie. He taught us how to make sure the question never came up. Francis doesn't believe in showing strength. He believes in removing the need to show it. When someone new enters his circle, they're tested, not with tasks, but with time. Weeks may pass before a second meeting. If they wait without complaint, that's step one. His method bleeds into the architecture of his operations. Buildings are bought under third parties. Storage facilities are divided by internal walls. What's in one section is never known to the next. The clubs, the cafés, the apartments, each run independently. If one falls, the rest hold. And most impressively, no one ever uses his name, not even among friends. They refer to him as le centre, the center, not in arrogance, in geometry, because everything orbits him, and yet he remains still. One inspector, years later, would say, "We knew things were happening, but by the time we traced one move, the next three were already buried." Mainstream law enforcement often struggles with men like Francis, not because they're too violent or too clever, but because they're too simple. Predictable only in their refusal to stand out. There's no bravado, no signature crime, no calling card, just patterns of clean exits and perfectly timed silences. Many people still think the real genius of the Vanverberghe method wasn't in what it did, but in what it prevented. There were no slip-ups, no drunk phone calls, no eager underlings looking to climb too quickly, because everyone knew the rule. You rise only when the center calls your name. And he usually doesn't. So what do you think? Is control more effective when it's shouted, or when it's simply assumed? Because in the Paris underworld of the late 80s, no one asked how the Vanverberghe method worked. They just followed it and hoped they'd never have to explain it. The folder was supposed to be full. Instead, it held 3 empty sleeves, a blank tape, and a single espresso receipt from a Montparnasse cafe. The inspector closed it slowly, looked up, said nothing, because by the late 1980s, every attempt to build a case against Francis Vanverberghe ended the same way, in quiet failure. Raids were planned, wiretaps installed, surveillance units briefed. But when the dust settled, all they ever had was cafe chatter and music. Literally, music. One high-profile sting operation spent 3 weeks recording a line Francis's associate used to enter his office. They anticipated code words, whispered names, incriminating exchanges. What they got instead? Discussions about espresso beans. Jazz music, always instrumental. The occasional cough. Nothing actionable, nothing illegal, just tasteful ambiguity. The task force called it Operation Velvet, and it failed, spectacularly, not because Francis outsmarted them with high-tech systems or brute force, but because he removed every reason to be interesting. He was never recorded raising his voice, never seen entering warehouses or touching contraband. Even his car, an understated Citroën, was routinely cleaned and rerouted, and his phone changed monthly. Always answered by a woman with a pleasant voice who simply said, "He's not available." Francis didn't erase evidence, he pre-erased it. There was an incident, never reported publicly, in which a junior inspector filed a formal complaint about missing documents related to one of Francis's business entities. Within a week, the inspector's superior politely informed him that the entity had never officially existed. The junior officer was reassigned. The file was logged under administrative error, and the office coffee machine began brewing better espresso. Coincidence, surely. Some say Francis had moles inside the precincts. Others argue it was just leverage, photos from long-forgotten poker games, whispers from old debts suddenly recalled. Whatever it was, the result was the same. Every trail that pointed to Francis grew cold the moment it got warm. Even the judges were cautious. One magistrate, off record, confessed, "You don't prosecute a man whose silence makes the room feel smaller." As these failures stacked, something stranger began to happen. Files started breaking themselves. Tape reels snapped inexplicably. Documents misplaced in locked cabinets. Recorded conversations overwritten by smooth saxophone solos. One internal affairs officer jokingly suggested Francis had found a way to possess cassette players. No one laughed. Eventually, the police stopped building cases. Not officially, of course. They still drafted reports, still took photos, still logged hours. But the enthusiasm dimmed. Like a hunting dog that knows the prey has already slipped the leash, Francis never gloated. He simply carried on, signing nothing, admitting nothing, reacting to nothing. His favorite trick? Meeting in places already under surveillance, sitting calmly, drinking tea, talking about nothing, just enough to burn the wire budget without delivering a shred of substance. By 1989, one officer privately declared, "Vanverberghe isn't a man, he's a technicality in a suit." Mainstream history blames bureaucracy for the failure to bring him down. They cite underfunding, poor oversight, outdated systems. But many people still think it wasn't weakness, it was design. That Francis didn't survive the system. He became the blind spot it could never focus on. So what do you think? Can someone vanish not by hiding, but by standing exactly where no one expects meaning to exist? Because in Paris, a misplaced folder is an inconvenience. But a folder that opens to silence? That's a signature. It begins with a dinner, not an event, not a negotiation. Just a dinner. 2 men, 2 glasses of wine, and a silence that weighs more than the plates between them. The place is nondescript. A small bistro near Parc de Butte-Chaumont, closed to the public that evening. No reservations taken. Just a chalkboard that reads, "Privé." One man is Francis, the other is Jackie Imbert. If Francis is the still water of Paris, then Jackie is the stone that once made waves across the South, known as Jackie Lamat, Crazy Jackie. A Marseille boss, survivor of more betrayals than most men have had cigars, shot, stabbed, forgotten, and resurrected. No one expects them to dine together. Their paths should never have crossed again. Too much history, too many ghosts. But here they are. They shake hands like men who've rehearsed it, like 2 nations ending a quiet war. They order without menus. They talk without posture. And according to the waiter, who was paid to forget everything, they both smile once. Just once. What do they talk about? That's the question everyone asks. Some say they discussed old debts. Others swear they traded favors. But the most persistent rumor is that they spoke only of time, how much they'd seen, how many they'd outlasted, how elegant it was to remain when so many had burned fast and bright. There's no toast, no dramatic farewell. Just 2 men chewing slowly, nodding between bites, and leaving through different doors. But in the days that follow, small shifts begin. A club in Marseille closes. A portside warehouse changes hands. A loan shark in Paris quietly retires to Corsica. These aren't obvious moves, but if you follow the pattern, they form something close to a signature, a redistribution, a trimming of weight. Jackie returns south. Francis stays in Paris. But the invisible line between them? It fades. No longer a divide. Now just part of the map. The underworld takes note. For decades, Paris and Marseille had danced uneasily, each claiming its corner, each throwing quiet elbows when the music changed. But now, with one dinner, the tension softens. Not peace exactly, but alignment, and those who work beneath them, Smugglers, brokers, carriers, they understand immediately. The rules have changed. The borders have blurred. This wasn't a truce. This was two old titans agreeing to stop pretending they weren't in the same story. Francis says nothing about the dinner. But a week later, he visits Lizette, wearing a lapel pin shaped like a key. No one asks why. The gesture is enough. The message, received. Mainstream historians will miss this meeting entirely. It isn't loud enough for textbooks, too clean for documentaries, but many people still think it marked the beginning of Francis's final phase. The moment he stopped expanding and started refining, because empires aren't built on movement. They're built on understanding who not to fight. So what do you think? Does power peak when rivals fall, or when they pull out a chair and pour the same wine? Because after that night, no one in France mistook Francis for a regional player. He was national now, and the man who used to walk alone now shared the silence with someone who'd earned it. He trusted the boy. That was the mistake. Or maybe not trust. Allowance. Francis had rules for everyone in his orbit. Never show up drunk. Never speak twice when once will do. And never, under any circumstances, believe that proximity meant protection. But the boy did. His name was Arnaud. Young, sharp-jawed, polite to a fault. The kind of man who opened doors for women and asked old men how they took their coffee. He'd risen fast, too fast, some said. Started as a runner, then a courier, then someone who sat a little too close to Francis at Lizette. He was never given full confidence, but he was observed. And when Francis observes someone, he doesn't do it idly. The whispers began in the Latin Quarter. Always there. Always too eager. Arnaud's name appeared next to people it shouldn't. A crooked notary in Montreuil. A loud-mouthed bar owner with debts to the wrong Albanians. Then came the real offense. A file left behind in a car glove box, carelessly. It contained routing schedules, coded but not encrypted, for 2 discrete shipments due through Orly. It was intercepted. Nothing was seized. But the schedule was now known, and that meant someone talked. Francis didn't summon Arnaud. He didn't even call. He just waited. 3 days passed. On the 4th, Arnaud showed up at Club Lizette, uninvited. Pale, his tie loose. He asked to speak to Francis directly. The bartender told him, "He already heard you. No threats, no scenes. Just one sentence," and the air changed. By morning, Arnaud was gone. Not dead, not disappeared, just gone. Some say he fled to Spain, others to Senegal. A few whisper that he stayed in Paris under a different name, working nights as a concierge in a hotel that never asked questions. Wherever he went, he never spoke of Francis again. And the lesson crystallized. Betrayal doesn't always end in bullets. Sometimes it ends in quiet erasure. What followed was swift. Francis restructured. Every junior liaison was rotated. Routes shifted. Codebooks rewritten. For 3 weeks, nothing moved. It was as if the whole city took a breath and held it. When business resumed, it did so with new eyes watching, and the message was clear. You don't get a second chance. You get one clean exit among Francis's closest circle. It became known as le rappel silencieux, the silent recall. One lieutenant described it like this. He never tells you you're done. You just start noticing no one calls you back. No doors open. And you realize he's already folded your chair. The Latin Quarter settled. The loose talk faded. Arnaud became a ghost no one dared to mention. And Francis? He returned to his regular booth. Same drink, same tempo. But now, when newcomers entered his orbit, there was a new rule. No one rose fast anymore. No one skipped the silence. Mainstream stories about organized crime often glamorize loyalty as some eternal bond. But in Francis's world, loyalty was renewable. Daily, quietly, with every choice you didn't make. Many people still think Arnaud's exile wasn't just a punishment, it was a ritual, a reset, to remind the entire system what happened when distance wasn't respected. So what do you think? Is betrayal punished best with fury, or with a clean, forgotten absence? Because after Arnaud, everyone in Francis's world walked slower, spoke softer, and double-checked every envelope. It starts with a cargo manifest that doesn't exist, or rather, it used to exist, filed neatly under industrial parts bound for Brussels. But somewhere between the port in Le Havre and a quiet loading dock in Charleroi, the paperwork evaporates. No alert, no flag, just gone. And in its place, a sealed container moves with smooth efficiency, trailing no attention, guided by silent hands. Inside, not parts, polished diamonds, stitched into upholstery, hidden in the lining of car doors. Some real, some synthetic, all untraceable. It's the latest evolution of Francis's reach, the Belgian connection. By the early 1990s, Antwerp has become Europe's beating heart for diamond trade, legit and otherwise. Dealers there speak in nods. Brokers swap stones in cafés while sipping mint tea. And every car that crosses the French-Belgian border unchecked, a conversation already had. Francis doesn't appear in Antwerp. Not once, but his name arrives daily. He builds the pipeline carefully. First, through a middleman, a Flemish antique dealer with an eye for forgery and a distaste for loud voices. Then, through a Senegalese jeweler with a cousin on the customs board. The flow becomes smooth, quiet, unremarkable, and that's when the weapons follow, because where diamonds pass, arms can ride their shine. The brilliance of it all lies in the packaging. Nothing looks illegal. No crates, no serial numbers. Just innocuous parts, door panels, brass fixtures, auto trim, disassembled, disguised, declared. Francis's crew never touches the cargo directly. They manage the orchestration. When the customs shift changes. Which tunnel is safest at 3:42 a.m.? Which inspector's daughter just got into a prestigious university, funded by a scholarship that arrived quietly? In Paris, Francis barely shifts his schedule. But the tone changes. His meetings start including names from Brussels, Ghent, even Rotterdam. One associate remarks, he stopped playing with the city and started playing with the continent. The financial windfall is immediate. But Francis is careful. No sudden spikes, no new cars, just a slow uptick in property holdings. A new building near Gare du Nord, a renovation permit in Liège, a discreet art acquisition in Luxembourg. Then there's the Zurich account. Old money meets old rules. Withdrawals never large. Deposits always timed with holidays. The Belgian connection also marks a change in his lieutenants. A younger crop begins to rise, not brash, not hungry, just precise, fluent in more than French, wary of paper. He mentors them slowly, one lesson at a time. In one meeting, when asked how he stays invisible, Francis replies, "Because I never rush the disguise. A fake must feel like it belongs." The operations expand. Diamonds through Ghent. Car parts in Lille. One confirmed transaction routed via a music festival in Namur, disguised as touring equipment. Still no arrests, no noise, and yet the agencies take notice. A Europol analyst puts together a partial map. It shows shipments linked by coincidence, by non-overlapping vendors, by whispers. The analyst calls it the Silent Archipelago. The report is buried within a month. The analyst is reassigned. Mainstream records file most of this period under cross-border smuggling, a vague term meant to soothe readers and silence questions. But many people still think this was Francis's most elegant architecture. a European corridor that moved bloodless and wordless, yet heavy with profit. So what do you think? Is a legacy built faster with noise or stronger when no one remembers who built the bridge they're crossing? Because with Belgium in play, Francis Vanverberghe isn't just a Parisian ghost. He's continental weather, quiet, precise, and hard to trace. By 1991, Paris walks differently, not slower, not faster, just more aware. There's a weight in the air, like the city itself is holding its breath out of respect for someone no one ever sees coming. A silence that isn't absence, but authority. It shows in small things. Bouncers who check coats more gently, bartenders who lower the music when a certain table fills, lawyers who suddenly lose interest in certain files, because by now, Francis Vanverberghe doesn't run Paris in the way thugs or mayors do. He settles into it, like architecture. He doesn't appear in tabloids, but everyone knows. It's in the way a jeweler reopens after a burglary and somehow doubles in value. In the way a nightclub closes for renovations and comes back under a new name, but with the same staff, same owner, just less attitude. In how certain corners of the 17th arrondissement no longer seem to tolerate noise after midnight. He's never elected, never sworn in, but his rules are followed with more precision than the city's actual statutes. Even rival crews begin adjusting, not because they fear him in the usual way. There are no public beatdowns, no grand messages carved in blood, but because when things go wrong, he doesn't need to fix it himself. Paris itself corrects. A man skips payment on a quiet shipment routed through Orly. 3 weeks later, his business is flagged for fire code violations. The fine is modest, but the inspector visits daily for a month. Another man spreads rumors about Francis. Nothing violent, just carelessness. He finds his wife's favorite boutique has moved across the city. No forwarding address, no explanation. These are not attacks, these are reminders. The weight of Francis's presence is measured in avoidance. He doesn't sign deals anymore. His presence is the contract, his silence, the signature. A former politician, disgraced, and now running a modest wine export firm, refers to him as the Don you never shake hands with, just nod toward. That year, a journalist attempts to write a profile, digs into property records, finds connections between Francis's inner circle and a dozen discreet corporations. He presents his findings to his editor. The next morning, he withdraws the piece. No reason given. He takes a 3-month sabbatical, moves to Lyon. One theory says he received a call from a blocked number with no voice on the line, just the sound of espresso being stirred. Francis never denies or confirms anything. But later that week, he's seen at Lizette, seated alone for 20 minutes, then joined by an older man in clerical attire. They talk. No one hears a word. By now, even the church adjusts its stance. One priest, off record, says, "He sins like a gentleman." If God doesn't forgive that, who will? Mainstream history moves on. Paris is full of noise again. Fashion weeks, elections, economic forecasts. But under it all, there's still the hush. The corridor between Rue des Martyrs and the Place de Clichy, where shopkeepers glance up when a certain car passes, because Francis doesn't need force. He has gravity. Many people still think that by the 1990s, his real weapon wasn't power, but reluctance. The way people turned themselves into accomplices just to keep the peace. So what do you think? Does control reside in what a man does, or in what others choose not to do, because of him? Because in Paris, you could shout all you wanted, but the man no one dared whisper against? He already owned the quiet. They called it Operation Nuit Blanche, White Night. On paper, it was a quiet collaboration between 2 French intelligence arms and a fresh-faced anti-corruption unit. Off paper, it was the last coordinated attempt to untangle Francis Vanverberghe's web. No press, no leaks. Just hushed meetings in overlit rooms, maps pinned to corkboards, and a rotating team of analysts, some too young to remember when Francis first entered the game. The mission: expose the structure, not the man, the method. They knew better than to expect anything directly tying him to crimes. But maybe they could isolate the system, the fake companies, the logistics nodes, the licensed silence surrounding him. They started with a courier, a man who had delivered envelopes across arrondissement lines for nearly 5 years, never paid by the same source twice. He agreed to cooperate, gave them 3 addresses, 2 names, and a burner phone. 3 days later, he changed his mind, showed up at the precinct, returned the advance payment, and asked if he could just disappear politely. He left for Canada that week. Then it was the florist, a woman whose boutique sat next to a known drop site. She admitted to overhearing names, seeing men carry boxes labeled textiles that didn't rustle like fabric. But before the officers returned for a second interview, her shop had closed, replaced overnight by a vape store. And the florist? Now tending roses in Nice. No forwarding number. Then came the string of internal breakdowns. The wiretap authorization got lost in processing. A surveillance van was found to have faulty equipment, twice. One lead detective was suddenly promoted to a post in Marseille. Every thread they pulled turned to silk, smooth, expensive, and utterly resistant. And Francis? He carried on, unmoved, his schedule unchanged. He still walked the same blocks, still dined once a week in a brasserie with no name, still paused exactly 4 seconds before answering his phone. It was as if he already knew about Operation Nuit Blanche. Some claimed he had someone on the inside. Others said he didn't need one, that his network was so deeply folded into the city's rhythm, even attempts at disruption ended up reinforcing it. The final blow came quietly. One of the intelligence officers, an ambitious, clean-cut analyst, was found asleep in his car outside Club La Z. Engine running, windows cracked. When woken, he claimed he had no memory of the last 12 hours, no substances found in his system. He transferred to Brussels the following month. No public explanation. The operation was shuttered 2 weeks later. Files sealed, leads marked inactive. Nothing gained, nothing said. Francis never acknowledged it, never commented, never changed pace. But 2 nights after the file closure, a package arrived at the desk of the officer who had pushed hardest for the probe. No return address, no note. Inside, a black necktie, silk, immaculately folded. That officer retired early. Mainstream media never mentioned Operation Nuit Blanche. Too quiet, too embarrassing. But many people still think it wasn't a failure of evidence. It was a failure of language. The state tried to speak in laws and files and strategy. Francis spoke in absence, and Paris by then understood that language fluently. So what do you think? Is invincibility earned by action, or by becoming the space no one dares define? Because Operation Nuit Blanche didn't uncover the truth. It just confirmed what everyone already suspected. Francis Vanverberghe wasn't hiding. He was what you found when you looked too closely. On a cold October evening in 1992, an auctioneer clears his throat, and Paris holds its breath. The venue is discreet, an upstairs salon near the Seine, used more often for estate sales than criminal whispers. But tonight's guest list isn't made of socialites or collectors. It's a mixture of diplomats, heiresses, and quiet men in tailored overcoats whose names never appear in magazines. Sotheby's is running the show. And the highlight of the night is a modest oil painting attributed, perhaps generously, to a minor 19th century French artist. The bidding opens low, climbs slowly, then jumps. A sudden flurry of gestures, nods, numbers whispered behind gloves. The painting sells for just under 1 million francs. Applause is polite, fleeting. But the real transaction never touches canvas, because while the auction dazzles upstairs, a different kind of art is being moved below, 10 feet beneath the parquet floor, in a storage room marked security. 2 identical wooden crates are quietly exchanged. No alarm, no guns, just one nod, 2 handcarts, and a ledger adjusted by half a decimal. What was swapped? No one ever confirms, but whispers mention bearer bonds, some as old as the de Gaulle administration. Others speak of war-era gold, untraceable and unclaimed. What's known as this? By morning, an offshore account in Liechtenstein reflects a deposit just shy of 4 million francs. No sender listed, no questions asked. And Francis, he never attends the auction, never places a bid, but one of the attendees, a retired cultural attaché with connections to both shipping and silence, is later seen having espresso at Le Z. Francis joins him briefly. They speak for 12 minutes. The attaché leaves without his briefcase. No one opens it. No one ever sees it again. This is what Francis has mastered, the art of diversion. He doesn't move money through banks. He moves it through attention. While people watch one hand, the other signs nothing and still gets paid. His use of auctions becomes legend. A baccarat vase sells for far more than it should. A sculpture goes missing en route to Zurich and reappears in Marrakesh. Only it's hollow now. Weighted not with bronze, but documents. The press, when it notices, blames eccentric billionaires and poor logistics. But those in the know call it Vanverberghe's ballet, a choreography of elegance and extraction. Even the institutions adjust. One Parisian gallery director admits, quietly and only once, that he no longer questions anonymous endowments. He just accepts them and updates the plaque. There's a rumor about one auction in Lyon where a forged Degas sold for 7 times its value. Days later, a shipment of surveillance equipment bound for Eastern Europe vanished mid-transit. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the painting didn't hang in a gallery. It simply opened a door. Francis's network thrives on these trades. Not illegal by definition, just unsupervised. And as with everything he touches, there's no trail. Many people still think the brilliance of Francis's auction play wasn't in the money, but in the message. You can hide anything if you frame it nicely. So, what do you think? Is crime more dangerous when it's armed, or when it's curated behind velvet ropes? Because in Francis's world, a well-placed bid could shift nations, and the real masterpiece was the silence that followed. It's a photograph, more than anything, that stirs the whispers again. Grainy, black and white. Published once, in a local magazine that folds 2 months later. The composition is simple. A narrow street in the Marais, light hitting just right, and 2 figures frozen mid-step. One of them is Francis, the other a priest. Not just any priest, but Father Rémy Dubois, a Jesuit known in certain circles for ministering to men who no longer believed in salvation. They're not talking, they're smiling. And that's what gets people talking, because Francis doesn't smile often. And when he does, it's never in public. The photo is taken from a distance, but the expression is unmistakable. Warm, tired, almost nostalgic. A rare, unguarded moment. The questions come fast. Was it a confession? A negotiation? A farewell? No one knows. But something shifts afterward, within weeks. A nightclub in Montparnasse shuts down, and the building is sold to a charity overnight. A known fixer in the 14th arrondissement liquidates his assets and moves to Lourdes. An arms broker is seen donating envelopes to a church in silence, then disappearing entirely. Francis never mentions the priest, but his movements become more precise, less frequent. Meetings shorten. Phone calls go unanswered longer. Le Z operates as usual, but Francis visits less. When he does, it's earlier. No more midnight arrivals, just dusk. The hour when shadows are long and the city exhales. People begin to wonder, is he winding down or preparing for something? Then something stranger. He visits an art museum, alone, no reservation, no press. Just a quiet walk through the sculpture wing, hands behind his back, stopping for nearly 10 minutes in front of a marble figure with a broken nose. When asked later by a museum employee if he needed assistance, he replied, "No, I'm just admiring what survives." That line, what survives, becomes something of a mantra among his inner circle, because Francis isn't disappearing, he's refining. He begins selling, slowly, discreetly, warehouses, apartments, even a vineyard in the Rhone that few knew he owned. But none of the money vanishes. It's repositioned, funneled through charitable trusts, cultural endowments, educational grants. A youth center opens in Saint-Saint-Denis. The name on the plaque? Anonymous donor. People speculate. They always do. Some say he's trying to atone. Others insist it's strategy, a redirection of power. Many people still think it wasn't a change of heart. It was just the final movement of the score, because Francis doesn't believe in legacy like other men. He believes in systems that don't require names. He once said to a confidant, "Statues are for those who need to be remembered. I'd rather build the bench people sit on without asking who laid the stone." So what do you think? Does power fade when it gives, or does it deepen when it no longer needs to take? Because in Paris, a smile from a man like Francis isn't a weakness, it's a watermark, a signature without ink. And in that photo, between his shadow and the priest's, Paris saw something rare, a man nearing the end of a sentence he'd written in silence. On a quiet morning in December 2000, the city wakes to fog, thick, unmoving, like a breath no one finished exhaling. The Seine runs slow. Paris presses snooze. And somewhere in the 17th arrondissement, a phone rings that no one answers. Inside a modest third-floor apartment, plain curtains, polished floors, a single photo on the wall. Francis Vanverberghe is dead. No spectacle, no noise, just stillness. He dies in his sleep, in his own bed, with the sheets neatly folded at his waist and a lamp still glowing beside the armchair where a half-read book rests. Spine bent but unbroken. No signs of struggle, no medical crisis, just a heart that stopped as politely as he lived. There is no autopsy, no funeral announcement, no public mourning. But those who knew know. Within hours, word spreads through the channels that never needed phones. A storage unit in Ivry-sur-Seine is emptied by 4 p.m. A lawyer in Geneva receives a box with handwritten instructions. A florist delivers white roses to a priest who doesn't smile often, but does that day. Le Z closes for the night. No explanation, just a sign that says, "Back soon," and the city holds its breath. No national news covers the death. No obituary is printed. But within 48 hours, 2 debt ledgers are erased. A restaurant changes owners. A young man in Bastia receives keys to a building he never knew his grandfather helped build. Francis's name doesn't pass lips. Only his habits echo. The apartment is cleared by a woman in gray gloves. She keeps nothing but the photo on the wall. A seaside chapel in Corsica. No people, just stone and sky. The only paper left behind is a note, unsigned, folded inside a first edition of Le Silence de la Mer. It reads, "All debts settled. If you must speak of me, lower your voice." The silence after his death isn't emptiness, it's instruction. His network doesn't crumble, it adjusts. The system he built lives on, not in orders, but in reflex. Old favors are repaid, accounts closed clean, loyalty returns home like a trained bird. There is no power struggle, no vacuum, just continuity, Designed so precisely, it barely flickers. Mainstream France never mentions the name. Too clean, too shadowed. History textbooks leave him out entirely. But in backrooms, late-night cafés, and the soft margins of state records, the legacy hums. Not as myth, as method. Many people still think that Francis's greatest success wasn't what he built, but how he left. With no alarms, no unfinished symphonies, just the weightless closure of a man who had already written his ending long before death arrived. So, what do you think? Can a man truly vanish if every room still moves in rhythm with his silence? Because in Paris, they still pause sometimes when pouring espresso, still glance at a certain corner booth, not out of fear, out of muscle memory, out of respect. And now, we soften our steps. Let the city dim behind us, the hum of old Paris narrowing to a hallway of gentle echoes. The night, like Francis, doesn't announce its presence. It simply arrives and lingers, familiar and weightless. His story, woven through silence and careful gestures, rests now in the places we forget to look, in quiet cafes, folded bills, locked drawers, and footsteps that never hurried. No applause, no curtain, just a pause, and then stillness. Let your thoughts drift, like fog curling through narrow streets. There's nothing to chase. No more names, only rhythm, only rest. May your night carry the weight of his calm. May your breath slow to the beat of soft jazz from another room. And may your dreams, like Francis's legacy, slip in without a sound. Sleep well.